Hello, guys, this is your friend, and we are back with a new fanic. And if you enjoy this fanic, then please press the like button and subscribe to my channel for more fanic like this. And now let's start the fanic.
A couple days later in Naruto's apartment, Naruto sighed yet again. Haku scowled and said, "Stop it, Naruto-kun. You need to dress appropriately for this meeting." Naruto sighed and replied, "Yeah, I know, but why do we have to wear this stuff?" He motioned to the kimono that Haku was helping him into. His kimono was basic white, but had an Uzumaki swirl on the right, but it also had a Yuki snowflake and a Hyuga flame on the left arm. Haku giggled and replied, "A semi-formal kimono is appropriate for the council meeting and ascension of our clan to the clan council. Kikyo-sensei will be there too. She is our guide for this meeting, since neither of us are Junin." Naruto chuckled and said, "Who would have guessed that my doctor was also an Uzumaki?" Haku giggled and said, "Yes, it is fortuitous." Naruto looked at his wife in confusion. Haku explained, "It is fortunate that she is, or we would have other problems." Naruto asked as he looked at Haku in confusion, "Like what?" Haku took on a serious look and replied, "Well, if she wasn't a member of the clan, then she could forward her own interests instead of the clan's, and we could do little other than complain to the Hokage and hope that we could replace her with someone more suitable." She finished with the kimono and pushed Naruto towards the door. She then continued, "We need to go to the meeting and not be late, since it will be looked badly upon us." XXXXXXXXXXXX. Naruto and Haku met up with Kikyo outside of the Hokage's tower, who wore a similar kimono to the couple. Kikyo smiled, bowed and then asked, "How may I serve my clan head and his lovely wife?" Naruto blushed and replied, "You can stand up and stop all that formal stuff." Kikyo giggled and replied, "As you wish, Lord Naruto-sama." Her demure became dark and she glared behind the couple. She then asked, "What can I do for you, Danzo-sama?" Naruto and Haku turned to find an aged shinobi who wore bandages on the right side of his face. His arm appeared to be in a sling or missing. He looked down at the Uzumaki couple and said, "I would like to have a word with Uzumaki-san, Kikyo-sensei." Kikyo immediately moved in front of the couple and said, "I not allow you to taint them the way that you have Yakushi-sama." The man smiled and Naruto began to not trust the man. "Whatever do you mean, Kikyo-sensei?" Danzo asked in an innocent tone. She slashed her hand across her body in a downward motion and declared, "I will not have you poisoning their minds like as did with Yakushi-sama. That discussion will be for a later date. We will be late for the meeting if you impede us any further." Danzo stepped aside and motioned with his cane that they could pass, but also said, "You would best watch what you say, Uzumaki-san, for it could get you into real trouble." Kikyo gathered up an angry Naruto and an agitated Haku and quickly rushed them past the man, while she could only glare at the man. After they entered the building, he said to no one in particular, "Keep an eye on them." He then followed the Uzumaki into the building. XXXXXXXXXXXX. The Uzumaki entered the council chamber and sat in the indicated chairs in the middle of the room. Naruto began to fidget with his kimono only for Haku to grab his hands and then place them on his lap. She then took his left hand into her own and smiled at him warmly. Naruto seemed to visibly relax. This raised a couple eyebrows in the chamber. There was a murmur around the council chambers. After a moment, the elders and Danzo entered the room. Naruto noticed the glare from Kikyo that was pointed at Danzo. He wondered what would cause his doctor and cousin to be so angry with someone. He was interrupted in his thoughts when the Hokage entered the room and took a seat at the head table. Sarutobi looked around the room and sighed when he saw the looks on those of the council. He took a deep breath and said, "Let the council come to order and the petition for clan status in Konoha of the Uzumaki." A man with dark hair and an angular jaw scowled and stated, "I would object, just to deny the boy any type of status other than what he already holds." "We already know how you feel, Kai, but under what grounds do you oppose?" Nara Shikaku asked in a bored tone. "He and his clansmen are only two," Kai replied with a satisfied look on his face. Sarutobi sighed and stated, the Uzumaki are a clan and there are several around the elemental nations, scattered by the wars. Even Mito-sama was an Uzumaki. Kai grumbled and then crossed his arms. He wore an angry look and replied, I still oppose it even if Mito-sama was an Uzumaki. Naruto began to stand, but was stopped when Kikyo turned and gave him a glare. She then stood and turned to Kai. She then said, I Uzumaki Kikyo, sitting in Naruto-sama's stead, since he is only a genin. The esteemed Uzumaki would like to establish our clan home here in Konoha, since our homeland of Uzushiogakure was destroyed and we were assured help by the Eternal Alliance. We ask in the name in the Eternal Alliance that was offered by the Senju clan and by Konohagakure itself. This was assured by the marriage of Mito Uzumaki-sama and Hiroshima Senju-sama. Need I remind council member Kai of the promise made to my clan when members of my family moved here? Kai wore a bored look upon his face and waved a finger in a circular motion. Yes, yes, we are all aware of what Tobarama-sama agreed to with the help of Mito-sama. He said that Konoha would accept anyone from Uzushigakure was welcome here in Konoha and if they wanted to establish a clan holding they could. I don't see why we should. There are only 2 of them left and it doesn't make sense to have a clan of only 2. Naruto began to laugh and then said, then removed him from being a clan. Kai glared at Naruto and said, who is this Tem, that you're referring to? Naruto smiled and replied, why Sasuke Uchiha, a clan of 1. Kai and several members scoffed at this and he said, he is more important than you ever could be, you urchin. Naruto glared at the man, but Kikyo held up her hand and stayed his anger. Council member Kai, you would say that one genin is more important than another and you would block our clan from its rightful place in this village compared to a child who can't even properly help the clans it is supposed to watch over. Kai stood up and glared at Kikyo and replied angrily, yes, anything to keep that boy from acquiring power. Naruto looked both worried and surprised by the outburst, but then clenched his fist and began to stand, but was held down by Haku. She then stood and put her hands together. She then smiled sweetly and said, you, esteemed Councilman Kai will treat my husband with some respect or you will not be able to continue your duties as councilman. The room began to cool and Naruto began to smile. Sarutobi sighed and said, enough, those who oppose the Uzumaki clan entry as a clan will not be on the council anymore if you continue to oppose. Now Naruto-kun, could you please raise the temperature in here? It's getting a little cold for my old bones. Naruto nodded and the temperature began to rise. Hiyashi stood up and said, the Hyuga clan will house the Uzumaki clan until they have a compound of their own. Sarutobi nodded and replied, that would be very commendable of the Hyuga, thank you. Hiyashi nodded and sat back down. Sarutobi clapped his hands together and said, now on to other business. The rest of the day was filled with dull business of the village and information about the upcoming Chunin exams. Naruto surprised everyone in the room except for Haku with being quiet and attentive during the meeting. Haku knew that the boy was figuring out how to get even with Councilman Kai. If nothing else, Naruto was a master planner when it came to traps and revenge, non-lethal of course. The meeting finally got out and Uzumaki clan was confronted by an angry Team 7. Kakashi asked, Naruto, why weren't you at the team meeting today? Naruto replied, I sent a clone to tell you that I was in a council meeting. I know you got the message. Kakashi nodded and replied, yes, but that will do Hatake-san. Hiyashi broke into the conversation. He then continued, he also has duties to his clan and to the village. He should be available tomorrow. The council apologizes for any inconvenience. Sakura balled her fist and moved to hit Naruto while saying, you screwed up practice today. She was stopped by a senbon to the throat and an angry Hyuga holding the fist. Hiyashi looked at Kakashi and said, you have some work to do with how this one treats a clan head. Sakura looked at Naruto in awe and asked quietly, clan head, how can he be clan head? Hiyashi replied, by being the son of the Red Habanero, Uzumaki Kushina. Kikyo is right now his advisory to the council, but Naruto is the head of the clan. Sakura counted on her hand and said, but that only makes 2 people for a clan. How can you have a clan when there is only 2 people? Naruto chuckled and replied, when a clan has been around a while and is the eternal ally of Konoha. Also there is a clan of 1 and you're fixated on him, so don't go complaining about a small clan. You also forgot about my wife. Sakura and Sasuke's eyes went wide and she asked, wife, what wife? Haku bowed and replied, I am Uzumaki Haku, a pleasure to meet you again. Sakura looked at back and forth between Naruto and Haku. Naruto chuckled lightly and said, I couldn't have planned a better prank if I tried and the punch line was perfect. Sasuke glared at Haku and asked, I was beat by a girl. Fight me and prove you can beat me. I think it was a fluke. Haku looked at Naruto who shook his head. She smiled and replied, I'm sorry, but my husband has forbid it at this time. Maybe some other time we can spar. She emphasized, spar. Kikyo sighed and said, as entertaining as this is, Naruto-sama, we need to prepare for our move to the Hyuga estate. Naruto nodded and the trio walked off. Kakashi smirked under his mask and said, now that was interesting. Sasuke glared at Kakashi and asked, how was that interesting? Kakashi smirked and disappeared in a cloud of smoke. Sakura turned to Sasuke and asked, you want to go out to lunch? Sasuke was already down the road and Sakura ran after Sasuke. XXXXXXXXXXXX. Naruto and Haku were taking off their kimonos when there was a knock at the door. Naruto sighed and the couple shared a look as if to ask, really? Naruto sighed and walked to the door. He opened it to find Sasuke standing there and Sakura just running up to the door. Naruto glared at Sasuke and asked, what do you want? Sasuke looked angry and replied, I want to fight her. Naruto rolled his eyes and then just shut the door. Sasuke's eyes went wide at his teammate just slamming the door in his face. Sakura was also in shock. Naruto returned to the bedroom and began to disrobe. Haku asked, who is it? Naruto scowled and replied, my esteemed teammates. He still wants to fight you. Haku giggled and said, that is too bad for him, since my husband has forbidden me from fighting him. She moved over and kissed him. Naruto accepted the kiss and wrapped her in a hug. They stood there for a minute until there was a pounding on the door. Haku grabbed a sundress and put it on. She then walked to the door and opened the door to find an angry Sasuke. What can I do for you, Uchiha-san? She asked in an annoyed voice. Sasuke glared at the young woman and said, you will fight me. Haku raised an eyebrow and said, my husband has said no and he means no. Until the time that he authorizes me to spar with you, I am to avoid any clash with you. Now we have important things to do. If that is all, I bid you good day. She then closed the door with a slam. She then walked into the bedroom and began to help Naruto pack. They continued on even with the pounding on the door. After an hour they had finished packing their meager belongings and headed to the door. They found an angry Uchiha and Haruno. We've been knocking for an hour. Why didn't you answer? Sakura asked angrily. Naruto chuckled and replied, we were kind of busy. Sakura balled a fist, but then turned when she heard a voice. Naruto-kun, Haku-chan, we have come to take you to your new housing per our offer, Hinata declared. She glared at Sakura and Sasuke. She then asked, Sasuke, Sakura, would please move as to not hinder our helping the Uzumaki clan to their new housing. Sasuke scowled, but moved out of the way. Sakura on the other hand moved to stand directly in front of Hinata. Hinata took a step back. Sakura smirked and said, we were here first and have to talk to Naruto, so don't get in the way. Hinata sighed and then turned to a boy whose scowl was deeper than Sasuke's. Hinata then asked, Neji-Nisan, what can we do about this? I defer to your wizened counsel. Neji raised an eyebrow, but then replied, Hiyashi-sama said that we were to bring the Uzumaki to our compound. He did mention that if we were opposed, that we were allowed to use whatever force was necessary to bring them to the compound safely. He mentioned that there might be some opposition and that our clan's honor depended on them arriving safely. Sakura paled at the possibility of having to fight. She stepped back while Naruto and Haku began to direct some of the cadet members of the Hyuga clan in taking items from their apartment. They watched Naruto sigh as he locked the door after the final item was taken, but Sasuke said to Naruto just as he began to walk down the stairs, "This isn't over, Naruto." Naruto sighed and shook his head as he walked away with the Hyuga. XXXXXXXXXXXX. Naruto and Haku smiled at room they had been given. While it was Spartan, it had a large futon along with a couple dressers and a desk. The couple began to unpack and fill the dressers with their stuff. XXXXXXXXXXXXX. The next day Naruto and Haku approached the bridge with his waiting teammates. Naruto and Haku then began to spar beside the bridge and on top of the water. Sasuke watched the pair intently, but then was surprised to see them pause and glare at Sasuke. Naruto ground his teeth while Haku said in an angry tone, "Do not use your Sharingan to copy our fighting style or I might be inclined to remove your eyes." Sasuke grunted and replied, as if. Sakura looked between the pair and Sasuke in surprise. Suddenly Kakashi appeared and said, "My little genin, I have submitted you to the Chunin exams." "So what's happening?" Haku sighed and replied, "The Uchiha is attempting to steal clan techniques. We will not have it. I agreed to help Naruto-kun's team, but stealing techniques is not part of being a team." Kakashi sighed and replied, "I would agree. Sasuke, you are not to use your Sharingan on allies, is that understood?" Sasuke grunted and replied, "As if they would have anything I would want, but I understand." Kakashi appeared very happy and said, "Good, now that is settled. We need to work on you becoming Chunin." The rest of the day was put into team drills, but Naruto only seemed to be present and do what was asked of him. Haku had to go off to work at the hospital, after a little while. Kakashi handed the members of his team a Chunin entrance form and told them to meet the academy in 3 days in room 303. 3 days and a couple practices later, Naruto was dressing in his new outfit. He had begun to like the tiger camo look. Haku had dressed in a similar outfit, but was blue camouflage, reminiscent of Zabuza's outfit. Haku had placed the equipment on the dresser for both of them the night before. She had also given Hinata pep speech about today. Haku had also met a couple of genin and been placed on their team 2 days ago to be entered into the exams. This surprised all 3 genin, but it also meant that they had an extra ally in the exams. They had met her new team and they seemed amicable. Their names were Genai and Anaho, since Kamugi was injured a couple days ago and they needed a ready, but effective genin to fit into their team. They seemed to work well as a team with Haku in the 2 days they had worked together, but also Naruto had told them to support Haku however they could. Naruto and Haku left the Hyuga compound ready for a mission. Hinata met up with them just as they left the compound, but also Neji was right behind them. This didn't sit well with Naruto since he and Neji still had problems. Flashback. Neji looked around, see a lot of the villagers scowling at the group, mainly at Naruto. He felt that the boy was bringing shame onto his clan and Hinata was helping by leading the way. While had to admit she had gained confidence in the last couple months, she was still a weak leader and would never amount to anything. He was brought out his musings when Naruto asked, "Burn a hole in anyone with your eyes lately?" Neji looked over at the younger boy and replied, "I do not approve of this, but the head of my clan is offering you and your clan residence in our compound, so do not bring disgrace upon my clan." Naruto scowled at the boy and replied, "I'm sorry I don't have a stick up my butt, hey, each to their own." Neji clenched his fists and said, "I do not as you say, have a stick up my I am showing myself as a dignified example of the Hyuga clan. By looking down upon everyone. Man, you must be fun all the time," Naruto replied and put his hands behind his head, as if he was taking a leisurely stroll. Neji gritted his teeth at the laid-back attitude of this genin. You should present yourself better, since you're now a clan head. Naruto closed an eye and looked at Neji with the open one. He then said, I will not act like someone I'm not, so drop it. Please Neji-san, don't aggravate my husband, Haku asked in a pleading tone. He then glared at the older girl and said, and you should act more like the wife of a clan head. Neji then found himself having to catch a fist from an angry Naruto. He smirked and said, you will have to better than that to defeat me Uzumaki. Naruto pulled his fist back and there was steam rising from both Naruto's fist and Neji's open palm. You shouldn't tell others how to act. I might not be refined, but at least I'm not an asshole. Hinata moved to his side and said, please Naruto-kun, he was requested to do this by my father, so be nice. Naruto glared at Neji for a moment and then sighed. He then said, if he agrees to not say anything until we get to your house, I agree to be nice to him. I will also keep my mouth shut as a way of keeping it equal. Neji turned his head and looked up. As if we were equals, he said quietly. Naruto rolled his eyes, but said nothing. The rest of the trip was quiet, but everyone could feel the tension in the group. Naruto even stayed quiet until Haku had shut the door. Neji fumed for the next couple days, but his duties kept the two apart from each other, thankfully for the Hyuga household. End flashback. Naruto had agreed to keep the peace between the two clans while he could. The four went their separate ways to meet with their team before the exams began. Naruto met up with Sakura and Sasuke, who thankfully had mellowed out over the last few days. Naruto walked up to the pair and they nodded to him. The trio headed to the academy where the exams were to be held. There was a commotion near a door, but Naruto shook his head and motioned for them to watch. In the middle of the commotion was a boy clad in green spandex, who wore several bruises and scrapes. Ha! You plan to take the Chunin exam with that? You should quit now, a boy with long spiky hair and a pair of swords on his back exclaimed. Please let us through, a girl with a pair of hair buns asked pleadingly. She was smacked across the face and to the ground by the same boy. This brought several comments from the gathered crowd. Sakura and Sasuke looked at Naruto, who just sighed, but didn't do anything. What did you say? Listen, this is our kindness. The Chunin exam isn't easy and even we failed it 3 straight times. Those that take this exam and end up quitting as shinobi, those that died during the exam, we've seen it all. The boy then smiled and then said, and Chunin often become captains of military teams. The failure of a mission. The death of a comrade, that is all the captain's responsibility. Yet kids like you think that you can pass. We are just thinning out those that will fail anyway. What's wrong with that? Sasuke began to step forward, but Naruto grabbed his arm and shook his head. He then pointed to the room number and then out the window. He then motioned for his team to follow. Sasuke glared at Naruto, but followed. They moved to the stairs and then went up them. They found Haku and her team waiting for them. So you noticed the genjutsu. Glad you didn't try to break it, since it will thin out the crowd, Haku stated. Sasuke looked at Naruto in confusion and then asked, how did he notice it? He's an idiot. Naruto sighed and replied, who is Hinata-chan's sensei? Sakura smiled and replied, Yuhi Kurenai, and she specialize in genjutsu. Naruto smirked and said, yep, got it in one, Sakura. Now let's go and get this over with. Sasuke grabbed Naruto's arm and said, you know that you're not the leader. We also have some unfinished business. Naruto sighed and replied, according to what I've learned, there is a written test, a survival test, and then a general tournament where if you get to that point you can possibly fight Haku-chan or me if you like, but until then we are teammates and fellow genin of the leaf. Sasuke and Sakura's eyes went wide at his explanation. Naruto and Haku's team moved up the stairs, with Sasuke and Sakura right behind. They made it up to the door only to find Kakashi and Haku's temporary sensei. Glad you all could make it or I would have had to turn you back, Kakashi said happily. Sakura looked confused, but shrugged it off when Sasuke grabbed her arm and pulled her into the room. Naruto looked around the room and saw lots of angry faces. He also felt some familiar chakra signatures. He turned and smiled at Hinata, who smiled back. Naruto then noticed Haku and her team move to the side wall. Naruto smirked when Ino jumped onto Sasuke's back. This started an argument between Ino and Sakura. Naruto would have proclaimed his belief in himself out loud, but Haku had told him to try to keep himself secretive as possible. Thanks to some work with Kikyo, he had started to learn about sensing chakra. He closed his eyes and felt the room. Most of the people in the room had about the same or a little more chakra than Sasuke, a few less and a few more. There were several interesting chakras in the room. He felt two overpowered chakras and he quickly zeroed in on those. First was the boy from Suna, Gaara. His chakra was tainted, that was the only way he could describe it. Then there was a girl from Taki with mint green hair. While her chakra was tainted, it was mellower than Naruto's, which he could tell was also tainted. It then dawned on him that there were 3 Jinchuriki in these exams. He felt one other chakra that seemed out of place, but it was a Konoha shinobi. The gray-haired, glasses-wearing boy had similar chakra levels of most Junin. This was an annoyance, but Naruto just thought the boy might be a plan to throw others off. He then felt a strong chakra, but it was different and he couldn't quite figure out what was different about it. He intentionally looked at the red-haired girl from Kusa with glasses. This earned her attention and also caused her to blush at the attention. He listened to the conversation between Sasuke and the gray-haired boy, Kabuto. The interesting thing was the things that were on the boy's cards. Missions and ranks of missions weren't what caught his attention, no. It was the information about the personal strengths of the people on the cards. Naruto immediately threw a kunai through the card with his name on it when Kabuto mentioned his bloodline expansion. He also noticed the girl from Kusa look at him in surprise when his name was mentioned. Naruto glared at Kabuto when he asked, "Why did you do that?" Naruto just replied, "That is privileged information and you shouldn't have it." Kabuto shrugged and tried to avoid an attack from a trio of Oto shinobi and was apparently injured by an unseen force. Naruto looked over at Hinata who had just deactivated her Byakugan, nodded that she understood the attack. Next the proctor and his assistants appeared. Naruto followed direction and waited for the proctor to give them directions on the test. Naruto ended up between Haku and Hinata during the written test. The rules were somewhat simple. They could not get caught cheating and Naruto was easily given a way out of this, by Haku writing on his paper in ice and him just putting it down on the paper. At the end most of the genin were worried as time ran out. Time for the last question, but first I must ask if you want to stay and answer the question or leave. The reason I ask is because if you fail this question you will not be allowed advance beyond genin, Ibiki explained. You can't do that, Kiba exclaimed in protest. Naruto chuckled and whispered, just ignore him. Hinata's father is more imposing. This earned him giggles from Haku and Hinata, but also a glare from Ibiki. You think that if you fail you will advance. You guys just got lucky to get me, since I will make sure if you fail this question you will never make it past genin, ever. I got authorization from the leaders and the Hokage to do this, so who is going to quit? He asked with a sinister smile. He then turned to Naruto and asked, so you think that Hiyashi-sama is more imposing than I am? Naruto put his hands behind his head and began to relax. He then replied, yeah, ever piss off a Hyuga? Ibiki chuckled and replied, I've pissed a few in my time and some others that would make your skin crawl. Naruto sat forward and stared the man in the eye. He then said quietly, I think I might have a trump card for you, but can't mention it, village secrets, you know. Ibiki kept his composure, but smirked at the boy. He then scowled and looked around the room to find a dozen hands in the air. All of you with your hands in the air will take your teammates and leave the room, he said authoritatively. He then waited another 5 minutes. He then said, for all of you that remain, he paused to watch their reactions and then said, you pass. The collective reaction was, "What?" Ibiki chuckled and began to remove his bandana. The scars on his face were just the beginning. He revealed a bald head with scars from cuts and burns adorning his skull. A Chunin or any shinobi in responsibility has to have the courage to accept that his mission might fail, but continue anyways. This is a lesson in what might happen if you continue with a mission. Those arrayed against you might do anything to make sure that your mission fails. Torture and killing is part of being a shinobi, so understand that if you continue with a mission that you as a Chunin are responsible for a mission's success and having the guts to complete it might just be enough for the mission to succeed. The next few minutes flashed by Naruto and his companions. A special Junin entered through the window and displayed a banner signifying her as the next proctor. The remaining teams headed to the training area 44, also known as the Forest of Death. XXXXXXXXXXXX. Naruto arrived just after Anko and smiled at the woman. Anko looked around and saw the early arrivals. Naruto nodded to Shino, but raised an eyebrow to see the mint-haired girl from Taki. He walked over and she looked at him with orange eyes. He blushed and smiled. "I like the color of your eyes," he said. The look of shock, then anger, and finally a smile crossed her face. "I can see that by your choice of clothing. I would advise that you stay away from me. I'm dangerous," she explained cryptically. Naruto looked down and said, "The loneliness is stifling, isn't it?" She turned to him, surprise plastered across her face. "What did you say?" she asked in confusion. "They hate you, but you really don't know why until later, and they shun or even hurt you for nothing you have control over," Naruto replied. She furrowed her eyebrows and asked angrily, "What do you know about the boy from Suna? You and I have a secret each and are hated for it." I show a happy idiot mask to hide my loneliness. The boy from Suna emits a menacing aura to scare others away. You look like you've learned to hate everyone around you. I almost did that, but it didn't do me any good, so I just became a prankster, he explained. You still haven't told me what you know about it, she said, more asking than anything. You, Sandboy, and I are all Jinchuriki, he replied, but then laughed. It was a dry laugh and continued. The power of human sacrifice, ha. We sacrifice and they use us as tools. I have decided to make my own path. He then looked into her eyes and saw tears welling up in the sides of her eyes. Be strong for now and we can talk after this portion of the test is over. How can you be so strong? She asked. I found someone and something to anchor me. I can be your friend and will ask for nothing in return. I think that you need one, he said. You know nothing, she exclaimed. Ridicule, beatings, assassinations, destruction of your stuff for no other reason than you contain a demon. You didn't ask for it, but it was thrust upon you. We have to live with it, but we can rise above it and learn to help each other. I know that there are 9 Biju and that means that there are 9 of us. I offer you the hand of friendship as the container of the Kyuubi and as a fellow Jinchuriki, he said as he offered his hand to the girl. She scowled, but said quietly, if you are sincere, I will accept your offer. I must push you away to show my teammates that I'm not sucking up to you. She then slapped Naruto's hand away and exclaimed, get away from me. She then winked at him, but he still saw sadness and trepidation in her eyes. The 20 teams all listened intently to the instructions given by Anko and filled out their forms and headed to their designated gates for the exam. 30 minutes later a bell was sounded and then the gates were opened, letting the genin in. XXXXXXXXXXXX. Naruto scowled as he sensed several teams approach from both directions. He perked up and said, we've got company. Sakura asked, which direction? Naruto replied with a smile, yes. Sakura scowled and said, not funny Naruto. Sasuke then said, we can handle them. Little did he know who they would face. Naruto crossed his fingers and thought, shadow clone. 10 new Narutos appeared in the clearing. He pulled out a kunai and his copies did the same. Sakura began to tremble at how serious Naruto was being. All the clones suddenly disappeared in clouds of smoke while Naruto cried out in pain. He scowled and was surrounded by at least a dozen Senbon. He also had at least 4 stuck in him at various locations. He then began to run through hand seals only to be struck by a gust of wind, throwing him clear of the clearing. A sinister voice that ran chills down Sakura's spine began to speak. Now that the annoying brat is taken care of, hand over you scroll, a defiantly feminine voice ordered. Sasuke grabbed Sakura and pulled her towards where Naruto flew off towards. A chuckle was heard. My, they run like little rats, a female with a grass headband said to her 2 companions. XXXXXXXXXXXXXX. Naruto was finally able to right himself before he slammed into a tree. He sighed and then said, "Great, I still need to get the hand seals down quicker." He jumped down the ground and then closed his eyes. He suddenly brought his kunai up and blocked 2 swords. Lucky, we have you all alone," a voice said. Naruto opened his eyes to see that he had blocked 2 swords. He turned his kunai and then spun around to his right. He was able to embed one of his kunai in the range shinobi closest to himself. The man screamed and jumped off. Naruto smiled and pulled out new kunai to replace the lost one. The man's eyes appeared to be quite angry. "You should just resolve yourself to dying at our hands, Konoha scum," he exclaimed. Naruto pouted and replied, "But I was having so much fun. Maybe Zabuza-sensei will reward me if I get my 10th, 11th and 12th kills." Knowing full well that Zabuza's body had been burned and then buried out at sea and only his sword was left as a memorial. The guy's eyes widened at the mention of the demon of the mist. This was enough for Naruto to push past the man's defense and push the kunai into the man's left lung and graze the heart. Naruto watched as the man collapsed and dropped his sword. Naruto turned to a specific tree and said, "If you don't want him to die, I would surrender now, because I know where you are and will spare your lives on the condition that you give me all scrolls that you obtained so far. I might even help heal him a little bit so you can continue and pester other teams." "How do we know we can trust you?" a voice asked from the tree he was looking at. "If you want your friend to live, you don't have a choice," Naruto replied. "Are you a censor type?" the voice asked. "No, I'm the Easter Bunny here to give you colored eggs." "What do you think, idiot?" he replied angrily. He then looked down at the man on the ground and said, "I would guess that you have about 20 minutes until the slice I gave to his heart will finally give way and he will die from hypertension and blood loss." He then turned and saw a scroll coming towards him. He raised his hand and caught the scroll. He then sighed and grabbed the seal and crushed it, causing the bomb tag to fizzle. He then whispered, "Idiot. You just killed yourself and your team." The injured and another man jumped at Naruto. Naruto sighed and ran through several hand seals. He then grabbed a couple kunai from his pouches. He whispered, "Wind style, great breakthrough." He tossed the kunai in front of his jutsu and it took the kunai straight into the 2 charging rain shinobi. The men were blown back into the tree, but were both about 3 feet above the ground. They then looked down at their chest and found a hole there and felt themselves being held up on the tree in their backs. One of them managed to whisper out, "How? Know thy enemy, know thyself and victory is assured, but if you don't know, go with overkill," Naruto replied and tilted his head with a smile. He then said, "I would have let you go, but you pushed the issue, but thanks for the scroll and the supplies." Naruto sadly watched as the 2 on the tree expired. He then rummaged through their stuff and took what he deemed as valuable and left the bodies after a small prayer. He then jumped off where he felt a larger chakra signature along with those of his teammates. XXXXXXXXXXXX. Sasuke was sweating and Sakura was barely holding on to consciousness at the killing intent that was coming off the grass genin. "This can't be a genin," Sasuke thought to himself. He grabbed several shuriken and threw them at their assailant. The woman smiled and said, "So the boy has some teeth after all." The woman suddenly disappeared as the shuriken reached her. She reappeared in front of Sasuke and kicked him and Sakura to the side with a fiendish laugh. She then said, "Let's have some fun, why don't we? The next several minutes were filled with the grass genin kicking the pair around a clearing. She finally stopped when a chill ran down her spine and her compatriots fell out of the canopy with their faces blued with death, but their lips were a dark bluish purple, as if they had been frozen to death. She then jumped back as a kunai with 3 explosive notes tied it landed in front of her. The notes went off and then the woman standing a distance away began to laugh. This little game is getting interesting, she said to no one in particular. XXXXXXXXXXXX. Naruto and his clones lay his teammates out and began to check them for injuries. Sakura glared at Naruto as his hands moved over her chest, but she then winced when he touched a rib. She knew better than to complain, since he was basically the medic for the team right now. She knew that he wasn't groping her because of the way he didn't seem to enjoy touching her through the fabric. He sighed and then said, "Well, Sakura, you basically have a cracked rib and a sprained wrist." She glared at him and asked angrily, "So how are my s?" Naruto replied while checking out Sasuke, "You pulled your left pectoral muscle. Otherwise I wouldn't worry." She was shocked and asked, "But you were groping me." Naruto shook his head and replied, "If I were groping I would have squeezed your nipple instead of using my fingers to go through the tissue to feel the muscle. Wish I knew diagnostic jutsu so I could give a better conclusion of what I find. Otherwise, I would say you are a girl and I have no interest in feeling you up, sorry. You can have Sasuke do that now if you like, since he is just bruised. We need to avoid that lady if at all possible." Sakura blushed at his statement, but then asked, "How did you find us, since we were so far from our original position?" Naruto sighed and replied, "I'm a sensor type, and the funny thing is that until Haku-chan, I never sat down and really learned to feel what was around me. I can tell where people are right now. We're about 100 yards from another team, but they are hurt and one of them is about to either die or pass out from chakra exhaustion." "What about that woman?" Sakura asked worriedly. "She is quite a ways away." "I'm also taking both of the scrolls," Naruto said as he pulled their scroll from the unconscious Uchiha. "Both?" Sakura asked. "Yeah, ran into a team of rain shinobi when that lady blew me away from you guys," Naruto explained, while he poured some water down Sasuke's throat. She looked worriedly at Naruto and asked, "Why you didn't kill them, did you?" Naruto sighed and replied, "I tried not to, but they gave me no choice, since it was 3-1 odds and I gave them a chance to withdraw." Sakura shuddered and looked worriedly at Naruto. He doesn't seem to be disturbed by killing, she thought. She then looked at Sasuke and asked, "Is he going to be okay?" Naruto nodded and replied, "Yeah, he is just exhausted. We need to toughen you both up." His joke wasn't well received. He then lay against a tree and closed his eyes. Sakura looked at her teammate in awe. XXXXXXXXXXXX. Haku sighed as she set the last of the third team that had attacked he team in the bushes. Her teammates had already given her accolades for her keeping them 1 alive and 2 getting them more scrolls. She then sighed at the third marriage proposal from her teammates. She couldn't tell the boy that she was already married at the moment, but just pushed their enthusiasm aside and tried to figure out where her husband was. She could feel his chakra beacon, since they had worked on his sensing ability. The big problem was that they were quite a ways apart and she was exhausted. The team set up camp and readied themselves for the night. XXXXXXXXXXXXX. Naruto suddenly sprung up and exclaimed, "Shit. She's back." This put both of his teammates on alert. They then heard laughter coming from all around them, but Naruto kept his eyes fixed on a certain direction. Ho, you are a sensor. I think I will enjoy this, Naruto-kun, the voice said. Naruto quickly pulled out his kunai and turned to block an attack. Sasuke and Sakura were in awe of the speed at which Naruto had blocked the grass shinobi. She then said, "You have progressed some, Naruto-kun. Now feel the full weight of my power." Naruto turned to accept the attack, but Sasuke and Sakura both fell the ground under the pressure of the killing intent let loose by this genin. Naruto's eyes flashed purple, but it wasn't noticed in the low light levels. Naruto threw caution to the wind and extended a palm forward. A gust of wind impacted the grass shinobi, throwing her back. Naruto was breathing hard from this exertion. The enemy got up and brushed off her outfit and said, "Seal less jutsu. I'm impressed, but you're still not on my level." Naruto dropped one of his kunai and began to do one-handed seals. He then opened his mouth and shot out several water bullets at the attacking shinobi, to no avail. Naruto was sent into the trees courtesy of a kick from the grass shinobi. She then said, "Bye, bye, troublemaker." She then clapped her hands and said, "Now to have some fun with you, Sasuke-kun." Sakura watched in awe as Sasuke was able to keep up with this genin, and eventually burn the woman. That was when she noticed something wrong. The face of the woman was burned off and she saw a man's face that ghostly white. The man broke the wires that Sasuke had wrapped him in and sent the fire that had burned off the face, like they were string. The man seemed happy that Sasuke was able to fight him at a sufficient level. Sasuke had reached his limit when Sakura had finally decided to try to help. She began to throw shuriken and kunai with abandon. The man watched in fascination as the girl was doing something that was basically impossible for her abilities. She missed, but she tried. She asked, "Who are you?" "Why, little bird, I'm Orochimaru, the snake that will swallow Konoha whole, but time for me to leave, but not before I leave a parting gift," he explained, while standing above an unconscious Sasuke Uchiha. He bent over and bit him on the neck. He then jumped back when a huge eye slammed into where Orochimaru had been. The eye broke into pieces and fell towards the ground below. He chuckled and said, "You're too late and now he will seek me out, but first to deal with you pest." He jumped up from the branch he was on and hit Naruto in the stomach. Sakura watched as Naruto's face contorted in pain and lack of breath. He then threw Naruto towards the ground, which was another 50 feet below her. A figure suddenly appeared and caught Naruto, arresting his plummet to a certain doom. Sakura looked relieved when she saw Haku and her team looking up at Orochimaru. The man laughed and then jumped away. XXXXXXXXXXXX. The two teams had set up camp inside of a large root system below one of the huge trees. Haku lay against the side of the cave, with Naruto held close to her. She had examined both Naruto and Sasuke, finding that both were exhausted. Sakura watched Haku and at the look of worry written all over her face. Genai entered the cave, and said, "Traps are set and we should know if anyone comes close." A string pulled a stick and Genai smiled. "We have guests, but we can wait for them to come to us, since this place is defensible. Haku-san, we are at your disposal." Haku nodded and smiled warmly at her teammates. She then looked back down at the boy in her arms. She wasn't quite sure what Orochimaru had done to him, but it had thrown his system out of balance and that is saying a lot for him. She then looked over at the Uchiha boy only to hear Sakura huff at the glance. Haku sighed and said, "I have no interest in the Uchiha boy, other than in medical terms. He is suffering from some sort of chakra poisoning as best as I can determine." Sakura looked at Haku and asked frantically, "Can't you do anything about that?" Haku sighed and replied, "Regrettably not. I lack the amount of chakra and the skill to help expunge the foreign chakra from his system. We will just have to wait him out and hope that he makes it through it." Sakura's face began to run with tears and she said frantically, "You've got to save him." Haku replied, "While I'm flattered with your belief that I have such skill, I don't. Now we need to prepare for our guests." Sakura scowled at Naruto and said, "What about the baka?" Haku's demeanor became dark and said, "You will treat him kindly or face my wrath. He, like the Uchiha, is suffering from a chakra malady that Orochimaru inflicted upon him." Naruto grimaced and said quietly while his eyes are still closed, "They are coming." Ganai looked at the boy in surprise, but then nodded and said, "Our guests are advancing." From outside of the cave a voice said, "Bring the Uchiha out and we will leave you in peace." Sakura looked worriedly at Sasuke and then at Haku and asked, "You're not going to give him up, are you?" Haku shook her head and replied, "No, it would destroy Naruto-kun's chances of becoming a Chunin. Genai-san, Anaho-san. We need to protect our fellow genin." Anaho nodded as did Genai. Sakura sighed heavily and said, "Thank you." Haku gently set Naruto down and then stood. She exited the cave and confronted the three. She scowled and asked, "What do you want?" A man wearing bandages around his head only showing his right eye replied, "We want the Uchiha." Senbon appeared in her hands and she asked, "And if we don't?" The man shrugged and replied, "We kill you." "I would like to see that, since we have already dispatched 3 teams to find the proper scroll. We can just add yours to our collection," Haku said in a nonchalant tone. The joy was just exuding from the mummified man. He then looked around and said, "Your traps are simplistic and easy to avoid." The disturbed earth. He then jumped up only for a log to swing at him and he pulled his sleeve back to reveal a metal encasement of his arm with holes in it. The log appeared to hit the man, but then shattered. He then landed in front of Haku and said, "Somewhat impressive, but not effective enough." He then swung at Haku who didn't move. He was stunned for a moment until Haku shattered and then fell apart into blocks of ice. His arms suddenly went numb and fell to his side. Haku then whispered into his ear, "You are still not at my level, but using sound is a nice touch." His eyes went wide and he turned to find nothing there. "Fight me, bitch," he exclaimed. From around the forest Haku replied, "You call me a female dog in heat." He turned to a tree and threw a kunai at the area by the tree. "I'm impressed that you could figure out where I was, but still not fast enough. Leave now or your team will not finish this event." The temperature began to fall and the breath of the 3 sound shinobi could be seen. The girl then said, "How is it getting so cold?" Suddenly a dark chakra began to explode from the cave. The third turned to cave and said, "What the hell, might as well just eliminate him quickly." He raised his hands just as Sakura began to exit the cave. He smiled evilly and exclaimed, "Decapitating shock wave." A gust of wind caught Sakura and sent her flying into the cave. Suddenly Sasuke appeared with Sakura in his arms. He looked down at her and asked, "Did they do this to you?" The third sound shinobi smirked as Sasuke handed Sakura to Anaho and replied, "Yeah, what about it?" He lifted his arms and fired a second wind attack at the face of the cave. He began to laugh as the dust cleared and Sasuke wasn't there. "Look, I killed him," he exclaimed happily. Suddenly his arms were pulled behind him and he felt a foot in his back. Sasuke was there holding the man's arms and sporting black fire-like marks on the right side of his body. He smiled eerily and asked, "You seem to like these arms of yours." He twisted and pulled on the arms causing the sound shinobi to scream in pain. He then pulled out a kunai and walked behind the man. He lowered the kunai to the man's throat, only for Sakura to wrap him in an embrace. "Please stop, Sasuke-kun," Sakura pleaded with him. Sasuke dropped his kunai and slumped into Sakura's arms. The man slowly rose only for a senbon to land in front of him. Haku looked down with eyes that bored through the man and said, "You will take your teammates and leave before you anger me and I destroy you utterly." He looked at both his teammates. The female was sporting a dead arm on the other side than the mummy and his arms were now useless. He nodded and replied, "This isn't over, but we will leave for now." He and his teammates jumped out of the area. Suddenly Lee jumped down and looked at both Haku and Sakura with hearts in his eyes. "Both of you are beauties without compare," he exclaimed. Haku giggled and said, "While I can only speak for myself, I'm not on the market." "I'm sorry, Lee-san." He then looked longingly at Sakura who shook her head as she put Sasuke gently down and laid his head on her lap. "I'm sorry, Lee-san. I'm waiting for someone," she said apologetically. Lee nodded and said, "If you can no longer wait for them then I will be there for you." He then jumped up into the trees. Ino suddenly jumped out of the bushes and yelled, "Get your hands off Sasuke and hand over your extra scrolls. We know that your team is the weakest, Sakura." Haku jumped down and said, But Yamanaka-san, they are not alone and your team is not up to the task of even taking on Naruto-kun if he were awake. Ino began to laugh and replied, Naruto. That baka, I could beat him. A sudden chill ran down her spine. Really, Ino? I would like to see that, Naruto said from the entrance of the cave. He then did several hand seals and roots came up from beneath Ino and wrapped around her ankles. Try and fight when you can't move, Naruto said jokingly. He turned to Sakura and pulled Sasuke over his shoulder. We need to get out of here. Haku nodded and helped Sakura to her feet. Ino growled and said, Naruto. You get back here and fight me. Naruto turned and replied, I'm a lot stronger than you think and I let Haku-chan do the fighting of girls for me if I can. You East pig. Ino exclaimed. No, he just knows that I will show less mercy to a woman. It isn't East to choose not to fight. Also he could lose his temper and show you just how dangerous he could be, Haku said as the group of 6 jumped into the trees and headed to the central tower. Ino cut the plants from her ankles not thinking of it, but both Choji and Shikamaru were looking at the plants in awe. XXXXXXXXXXXX. Orochimaru handed a note to Kabuto and then jumped off. Kabuto opened the note and his eyes went wide. He then signaled for his teammates to follow him quickly. XXXXXXXXXXXX. Naruto looked around at the assembled genin and only saw 7 other teams, 1 from Suna, Taki and Oto respectively and 5 including his own team from Konoha. Naruto tuned out everything other than any rules that might apply to them. He did take note that they would have to trim down the number of possible contestants for the 3rd and final round of the Chunin exam. Haku noted that Shino and the loudmouth from Oto were first on the list for mini-tournament. Haku watched as Shino would bait the man into showing his wind tubes and how they worked, along with how his arms weren't as injured as they first appeared. Shino showed that he was a good shinobi, in that he snuck his insects into Zaku's tubes and blocked them while he forced the man to reveal that both his arms were functional. This caused Zaku to actually use his decapitating wave jutsu, but with Shino's insects blocking the tubes the attack nearly blew the man's arms off. Shino was declared the winner and Zaku was taken to the infirmary. Next was Sasuke and Manji from Taki. Sasuke glared at Manji while the boy exclaimed, so you're the one who's on the team with the demon lover. Shut up, Sasuke said in a bored tone. Begin, Hayate said as he jumped away. Sasuke, having had a couple days of rest, now felt better, but Kakashi had warned him not to use the curse mark. He watched the Taki shinobi and then smirked. He had dealt with them before. He just hoped that this one didn't have a reserve of water. His hopes were dashed when Manji opened a water skin and did several hand seals. Water poured out of the water skin and formed a sword in the boy's right hand. Sasuke prepared by pulling out a kunai. He then dashed forward. Manji blocked the swipe with the kunai with his water sword. You'll have to better than that, weakling. We knew that Naruto-sama was strong and that he supported your team, Manji explained. Sasuke gritted his teeth and the two battled for supremacy with the weapons in their hands. Sasuke then asked, you insult Naruto 1 minute then praise him the next. What is with that? The pair jumped away from each other and then Manji answered, he is the savior of Taki and also loves our resident demon. That is all I can say without divulging village secrets. Now come at me and show me what being an Uchiha means. Sasuke screamed in anger and charged at Manji. Naruto looked down and said, he's losing control and might just lose, since Manji is controlling the match. Very observant Naruto-kun, Kakashi stated happily. He then continued, working with Haku-chan has been helpful in more ways than I had thought. Naruto glared at his sensei and said, like you've been doing much to help us with our abilities. Kakashi put a hand to his chest and exclaimed sarcastically, you wound me Naruto-kun. Naruto grumbled under his breath and said, as if I could. Kakashi laughed and turned back to the match. He sighed as he watched and saw Sasuke losing control of his emotions and forgetting that water beats fire in most cases. Sasuke was breathing hard. as was Manji, but Manji wore the smirk and said, "I'll give you this. You're good at least, but not as good as Naruto-sama." Sasuke growled and charged at Manji only to have his kunai pushed aside and his arm cut, thus losing the grasp he had on his kunai. Sasuke grabbed his right arm to stem the blood flow and then jumped back. He then took a deep breath and pulled out a dozen shuriken and threw them. Manji laughed as half passed by him, not even coming near him, while he blocked those that did with his water sword. He didn't notice the shuriken that passed him began to turn and arc around him. He realized too late that the shuriken were being manipulated by wires and most of the wires wrapped around him. He was able to cut a couple, but soon found himself tied up and unable to move. Sasuke smirked. He pulled out a new kunai and walked over to Manji and asked, "Do you give up or do I end you?" Manji sighed and replied, "I give up." Hayate then said, "Winner Uchiha Sasuke." Sasuke moved away with the medics to get his arm looked at. Fu began to prepare for her match against Kabuto. Kabuto took up a ready stance while Fu glared at the white-haired boy. Hayate brought his hand down and said, "Begin." He jumped back as to not be caught in any quickly used jutsu. Fu did several hand seals and slammed her hand down on the ground. She didn't say anything and Kabuto looked at the girl only for his senses to start to blare a warning. He jumped just as a spike of stone came up and hit his leg. He landed hard, but still stood. He looked down at the wound and saw a bleeding hole in his lower calf. He cursed himself for his inattentiveness. He then looked up and the girl had her mouth open. He was blinded by a sudden flash and then felt a kunai at his throat and another at his kidneys. "I give up, Proctor," he exclaimed. "Winner, Fu from Taki," Hayate exclaimed. It took several minutes for everyone's eyes to readjust to normal lighting after the flash. Rather anticlimactic, Kabuto-kun, the sound Junin said, who bore a striking resemblance to Orochimaru. "She caught me by surprise," Kabuto said in an embarrassed tone. Kabuto and the Junin both shared an evil smirk and both faded into the background. Ino smirked at the listed names on the board and said, "Looks like I get to prove who's better, Naruto baka." Naruto sighed and jumped down to the arena floor. He looked bored and turned his head to the side. "Ino, do you really want me to go all out? Or you can just give up now," he said, then smiled widely. Ino looked offended and said, "Bring all you got." Naruto looked the Hokage and the man looked at his wooden pipe and shook his head. Naruto understood the silent meaning. He then turned back to Ino and said, "It's time for you chill out with the baka comments." "Why should I? You were the dead last in class, after all," Ino commented. "Not everyone does well scholastically," Naruto said with a smirk. Ino growled and replied, "I bet you don't even know what that word means." Naruto chuckled and replied, "It means with schoolwork. Haku-chan has been a great help in learning. So you attribute your success to a woman. Glad you know your place," Ino said snobbishly. Naruto sighed and said, "Your husband, if you ever get one, will be whipped." Hayate sighed and said, "Begin." Ino said, "You have no clue." She then gasped when Naruto lifted his head and his bangs no longer hid his eyes. They were ice blue and she saw nothing in them. She then noticed the temperature dropping. Her breath began to form clouds of steam in front of her. "You have no idea what it is to be a partner. You insult my other half and now you will pay," Naruto said angrily. Ino began to shiver and asked, "What happened to the temperature?" "I told you to chill out," Naruto replied angrily. He took up a defensive stance. "You think you can intimidate me?" Ino asked angrily. Naruto shook his head and replied, "No, I'm in for a little retribution on what you fangirls visited upon me for no other reason than challenging Tem for some attention." "Bring it dead last," she exclaimed. Haku sighed and said, "She has no clue how much he is holding back." Sakura looked at her in confusion. "What do you mean?" "He has been abused by you and the other girls for years and there is a pent-up anger and I'm afraid he might let it loose on Ino down there. I was hoping that he would have taken some of it out on you," Haku explained. Naruto smirked and drew a kunai. He slowly walked around the ring, circling Ino. Ino pulled out some shuriken and threw them at Naruto only for him to block all of them. He continued to circle and their breath became more visible as the temperature continued to drop. The breaths of everyone began to create a light fog in the arena. Ino lost sight of Naruto in a thicker area of fog. Her shivering continued to increase as she wasn't used to the cold. She began to cycle her chakra to try to keep warm. She then heard Naruto call out from the mist, "Using your chakra to keep warm is a good tactic, but lights you up like a beacon." "So does your voice," Ino replied and threw a couple shuriken, only to hear them impact on the wall. "You know the loneliness is unbearable. I didn't have parents like you did, Ino. Mine were taken from me on the day of my birth. I just wanted friends and you girls berated and degrade me for nothing more than being an orphan and your parents' misguided belief that they were right." His voice lingered in the mist. "You are more of a loser now than you were in the academy," Ino exclaimed. She then had to jump to the side only for the shoulder area of her outfit to be cut. While it revealed the mesh shirt underneath, it only left her shoulder showing and nothing more. "You missed," she said happily. She then felt a cut on her leg near her crotch and looked down to see a red line on her inner thigh. She then noticed her wrappings begin to fall away. "Was that a hit, Ino?" Naruto asked from behind her. "You still can't win," Ino exclaimed through chattering teeth. "You sound cold. You know hyperthermia happens as a slow process," Naruto said in an annoyed tone. "Didn't know you knew such a big word," Ino taunted. "As you turn your leg wrappings are coming undone. I'm guessing you at least wear panties under, but do you want to show them off to everyone?" Naruto asked. "Pervert," Ino exclaimed. "Everyone is a pervert to some level after puberty. It is in our nature to procreate. We desire the experience of being close to someone. You desire to be close to Tem, but he has other desires and right now it doesn't include girls or women. Also he is looking for powerful woman, but I think that he is misguided, since if he found a powerful woman and she beat him he would trail her to the ends of the earth and never accomplish his goals. Now we can have a real fight if you like, Ino-chan," Naruto said in a voice that sent a shiver down her spine. She blocked high into her left intercepting a kunai held by Naruto. He looked down at her midsection, but Ino misinterpreted it as him looking at her chest. She looked down to see his other hand with a kunai and it was right at the level of her chest. She wore a confused look, but then Naruto jumped back. Ino saw her outfit flutter open revealing her black panties and her bra for a second. She crossed her arms and yelled, "Pervert." She then felt a blade up against her neck. "Rise slowly and I won't embarrass you too much," Naruto said authoritatively. Ino nodded and stood. He then made a simple order: surrender or lose all dignity. Ino felt herself become cold, but only where her clothes were. "And if I don't?" she asked. He whispered into her ear, "I know you feel your clothes are cold, but what you don't realize is that they are frozen and I will destroy them with just a hit, leaving you. Unless you're a true kunoichi and fight against a male, while use your feminine wiles to distract me with your state of new undress." Ino's eyes went wide and thought for a minute. She then became angry and said, "You wouldn't dare, Naruto." She then felt his hand hit her, but what surprised her was that something solid broke and hit her. It then broke as it hit the ground. He then said, "I could have killed you several times over by now, just surrender, Ino." Ino reached around and only felt her panties, instead of wrapping in the back of her skirt. She grumbled and then said, "Fine Naruto, you win, I surrender." Naruto backed off and pulled off his jacket. He then handed it to Ino. The fog suddenly hit the ground and the air began to warm. Ino sighed as she continued to shiver. Hayate then said, "Winner Uzumaki Naruto." Kiba was cold, but looked down and asked, "What just happened and why does she have Naruto's coat wrapped around her body?" Kurenai smiled warmly at the graciousness of Naruto for both preserving her dignity and offering his coat. She looked down at Hinata and saw her smile. Ino scowled and said, "You're going to replace this outfit. You're not my wife and it was damaged during the exams, so you pay for a replacement, Naruto replied in an annoyed tone. She lifted her hand to smack him, but retracted it when he asked, "Do you want me to take my coat back?" Ino sighed and shook her head. Naruto walked up to Hinata and nodded to her while she nodded back. He moved beside Haku and sat down. "You know that was a lot harder in here where there is so little water." Haku smirked and replied, "Yes, but you did just fine. You could have created it if you wanted to." Naruto closed his eyes and sighed. "You could have just destroyed her outfit." "Naruto," Kakashi said in a playful tone. "Pervert and pedophile. Next you'll ask Sakura to do a striptease," Naruto said angrily. Kakashi chuckled and replied to an angry Sakura, "That would be interesting, but not my thing. She's a little young for me." "A little young. That is like saying that you're only a little late. You're like her grandpa," Naruto countered emphatically. This comment brought a few giggles and a couple chuckles, but didn't placate Sakura, as she exclaimed, "Naruto." Naruto then pointed off in the distance and said, "Squirrel." This caused Lee to look in that direction, but Sakura continued to advance. He then smirked and pointed at the board, while he said, "We will have to do this at a later date." Sakura confused looked the board and saw her name along with Hinata Hyuga. She smiled and slammed her fist into her hand and said, "Guess this will be an easy match." Naruto shook his head and said to their sensei, "She is in for more problems than she is expecting." She confidently went down to the arena and took up a position opposite of Hinata in front of Hayate. "The weakling from our class who never got Naruto to acknowledge you," Sakura said in a demeaning tone. Up on the balcony, Naruto shook his head and said, "This isn't going to end well." Hinata lifted her head just enough for Sakura to see the determination in her eyes and she replied, "I have been acknowledged by Naruto-kun. By the way, how is it going with your unique love interest?" Sakura shrieked at the implied insult. "How dare you talk about Sasuke-kun that way?" she exclaimed. "Do you really know your teammates? I mean really know them?" Hinata asked. Sakura looked angrily at the Hyuga heiress and exclaimed, "I know them better than you do." Hinata smirked and got into a Jukin stance. Hayate signaled for them to begin. Sakura charged at Hinata, while Hinata activated her Byakugan. Hinata noticed two ghost-like images of Sakura appear on either side of her. She smiled and asked, "Did you forget something?" Sakura realized that Hinata's eyes could see through genjutsu too late. She was struck in the right chest and fell backwards, gasping for breath. Hinata stood above her and then asked, "Do you surrender?" Sakura, barely able to breathe, nodded yes. Hayate said, "Winner Hyuga Hinata." Hinata leaned down and whispered into Sakura's ear, "You should take a good look at yourself and reality. They don't mesh well." She then turned and walked up to the ring of observers. She gave Naruto a hug followed by Haku. Naruto noticed that this brought him to the attention of the Suna team.